Chapter 1. The Hook. A perplexing crime. The fog clung to the streets of London like a shroud, muffling the sounds of hooves on cobblestones and the distant cries of newspaper boys. It was a morning that seemed to resist clarity, as if the city itself were hiding something. I had just settled into my chair by the fire, the morning paper in hand, when the door to our Baker Street lodgings burst open. Inspector Lestrade stood in the doorway, his usual composure replaced by a pallor that even the dim light could not disguise. His hat was clutched tightly in his hands, and his breath came in short, visible puffs. "Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice uncharacteristically shaky, "I need your help. There's been a murder, or at least, I think it's a murder. But the victim, he doesn't exist." Holmes, who had been lounging on the sofa with his violin, set the instrument aside with deliberate care. His sharp eyes gleamed with interest. "Explain, Lestrade, and do try to be precise." Lestrade stepped inside, closing the door behind him. A body was found in an alley near Whitehall. A man in his 40s, well-dressed, no obvious wounds. But when we tried to identify him, nothing matched. No records, no witnesses, no missing persons reports. It's as if he appeared out of thin air. Holmes steepled his fingers, his gaze fixed on Lestrade. And the body itself, any distinguishing features? "None," Lestrade replied. "No scars, no tattoos, no signs of struggle. But here's the strangest part. When we brought him to the morgue, the coroner couldn't find any cause of death. No poison, no heart failure, nothing. It's as if he simply stopped living." I leaned forward, intrigued despite myself. "Surely there must be some explanation, Lestrade. A man doesn't simply vanish from existence." "That's what I thought," Lestrade said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But then I checked the records again. The name we thought we had, Henry Acton, it's gone. The file is blank. Even the constable who found the body can't remember his face." Holmes rose from the sofa, his movements fluid and precise. "Watson, fetch your coat. We have a case to investigate." Chapter 2. The Case Introduction. The alley where the body had been found was unremarkable, save for the faint scent of decay that lingered in the air. Holmes moved like a shadow, his keen eyes scanning every inch of the cobblestones. Lestrade stood nearby, his arms crossed, watching with a mixture of hope and unease. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" I asked, my breath visible in the cold air. Holmes crouched beside a patch of disturbed gravel. "The body was moved," he said, his voice low. "Dragged, to be precise. See the scuff marks here. They lead toward the street, but they stop abruptly." "What does that mean?" Lestrade asked. "It means," Holmes replied, standing, "that our victim was not killed here. He was brought here, and then, it seems, someone attempted to erase all traces of his presence." I frowned. But why go to such lengths? If the man was of no consequence, why bother? Holmes turned to me, his expression inscrutable. "That, Watson, is the question. And it suggests that our victim was anything but inconsequential." We returned to Baker Street, where Holmes immediately began pacing the room, his mind racing. "Lestrade, bring me everything you have on the case, every report, every witness statement, no matter how trivial." Lestrade nodded and left, leaving Holmes and me alone. I poured myself a brandy, hoping to steady my nerves. "Holmes," I said, "this case feels different, unsettling." Holmes paused, his gaze distant. "Indeed, Watson, it is not merely a matter of solving a crime. It is a matter of uncovering a truth that someone or something desperately wishes to remain hidden." Chapter 3. Early Investigation. The following morning, Holmes and I visited Scotland Yard to examine the records Lestrade had gathered. The files were sparse, filled with contradictions and gaps. Witnesses who had initially provided statements now claimed to remember nothing. Even the constable who had discovered the body could only recall a vague sense of unease. Holmes pored over the documents, his brow furrowed. "Watson," he said suddenly, "do you recall the name Henry Acton?" I thought for a moment. Yes, of course. Lestrade mentioned it yesterday. Holmes handed me a sheet of paper. "Read this." I scanned the document, my confusion growing. It was a list of names, all individuals who had gone missing in recent months. Henry Acton's name was not among them. "But that's impossible," I said. "Lestrade specifically mentioned him." Holmes' eyes gleamed. "Precisely. Someone has gone to great lengths to ensure that Henry Acton never existed. But why? And more importantly, how?" As we left Scotland Yard, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The fog seemed thicker now, the streets quieter. Even the familiar landmarks of London felt alien, as if the city itself were conspiring against us. Chapter 4. First Suspects and Misdirection. The fog had thickened by the time Holmes and I returned to Baker Street, the gas lamps casting faint halos of light that barely pierced the gloom. Holmes was unusually silent, his fingers steepled as he stared into the fire. I could see the gears turning in his mind, but I knew better than to interrupt his thoughts. Finally, he spoke. "Watson, we must consider the possibility that this is no ordinary crime. The erasure of Henry Acton, if that is indeed his name, suggests a level of coordination and resources far beyond that of a common murderer." I nodded, though the idea sent a chill down my spine. "You believe we are dealing with an organization?" "Precisely," Holmes replied, "and one that operates in the shadows, manipulating not only physical evidence, but also the memories of those who come into contact with it." The next morning, we received a visitor, a Mr. Edgar Whitby, a solicitor who claimed to have information about the case. He was a thin, nervous man with a habit of glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting to be followed. "Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice trembling, "I believe I may be in danger. I was acquainted with Henry Acton, or at least, I think I was. My memories of him are fading." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "Describe him." Whitby hesitated, his fingers twitching. "He was a businessman, I believe. We met at a club in Mayfair, but when I tried to recall our conversations, I found I could not. It's as if he's being erased from my mind." Holmes exchanged a glance with me before turning back to Whitby. "Did he mention anything unusual? Any threats or concerns?" Whitby shook his head. "Not that I can recall, but there was one thing, a name he mentioned in passing, the Order of the Forgotten. I thought nothing of it at the time, but now—" Holmes' expression darkened. "The Order of the Forgotten. Watson, make a note of that." After Whitby left, Holmes began pacing the room, his mind racing. "This is no mere coincidence, Watson. The Order of the Forgotten, if such a group exists, may be the key to unraveling this mystery." Chapter 5. The Secret Clue. Our investigation led us to a small, unassuming bookshop in Bloomsbury, its windows fogged with age and neglect. The proprietor, an elderly man with a stooped posture and a pair of spectacles perched on his nose, greeted us with a wary expression. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I've been expecting you." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Indeed? And why is that?" The man gestured for us to follow him into the back room, where shelves groaned under the weight of ancient tomes and yellowed manuscripts. "Because you are the only one who can stop them," he said, his voice trembling. "The Order of the Forgotten. They have been erasing history for centuries, removing those who threaten their power." Holmes' eyes gleamed with interest. "And how do you know this?" The man hesitated, then reached into a drawer and pulled out a small, leather-bound journal. "This belonged to Henry Acton. He came to me weeks ago, fearing for his life. He believed the Order was after him, but he didn't know why. Holmes took the journal and began flipping through its pages, his eyes scanning the cramped handwriting. "Watson," he said suddenly, "look at this." I leaned over his shoulder and read the passage he indicated. "The house on Caraway Lane does not exist. It is there, yet it is not. Those who enter do not return." Holmes closed the journal, his expression grim. "Caraway Lane. That is our next destination." Chapter 6. Rising Stakes. Caraway Lane was a narrow, winding street in one of London's oldest neighborhoods. The houses were tall and narrow, their facades weathered by time. But as we approached the address mentioned in Acton's journal, I felt a growing sense of unease. "Holmes," I said, my voice low, "are you certain this is the right place? The house doesn't seem to be here." Holmes frowned, his eyes scanning the row of buildings. "According to the journal, it should be between number 12 and number 14. But there is no number 13. I glanced at the buildings. He was right. The numbers jumped from 12 to 14, with no sign of a house in between. And yet, as I stared at the gap, I felt a strange sensation, as if my eyes were refusing to focus on something that was there, but unseen. Holmes stepped closer, his hand outstretched. "Watson," he said, his voice barely audible, "do you feel that?" I did. The air was thick, almost tangible, as if we were standing on the threshold of another world. Suddenly, a voice behind us broke the silence. "I wouldn't go any further, gentlemen." We turned to see a man in a dark coat, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that sent a chill down my spine. "Who are you?" Holmes demanded. The man smiled faintly. "A friend and a warning. Some truths are best left forgotten." Before we could respond, he turned and disappeared into the fog, leaving us standing in the eerie silence of Caraway Lane. Chapter 7. The House That Wasn't There. The man's warning hung in the air like the fog itself, thick and unyielding. Holmes stood motionless for a moment, his gaze fixed on the spot where the stranger had vanished. Then, without a word, he turned back to the gap between numbers 12 and 14. "Watson," he said, his voice low, "do you trust your senses?" I frowned. "Of course, but what are you suggesting?" Holmes extended a hand toward the empty space. "Close your eyes. Tell me what you feel." I hesitated, then complied. At first, there was nothing, just the cold, damp air of the London evening. But as I focused, I became aware of a faint vibration, like the hum of a distant engine. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniably there. "I feel it," I said, opening my eyes. "A vibration. But what does it mean?" Holmes' expression was unreadable. "It means, Watson, that we are standing on the threshold of something extraordinary. The house on Caraway Lane exists, but only for those who know how to see it." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small ornate key. "This was among Acton's belongings. I believe it is the key to unlocking this mystery, literally." Before I could respond, Holmes stepped forward, inserting the key into what appeared to be thin air. To my astonishment, I heard a faint click, and the air before us seemed to ripple, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a stone. "Follow me," Holmes said, stepping through the ripple. I hesitated, my rational mind rebelling against what I had just witnessed. But Holmes was already disappearing into the unseen, and I had no choice but to follow. Chapter 8. The Hidden Realm. The moment I stepped through the ripple, the world around me changed. The fog and the familiar streets of London were gone, replaced by a dimly lit corridor lined with ancient, oil-painted portraits. The air was heavy with the scent of dust and decay, and the floor beneath my feet creaked with every step. Holmes stood a few paces ahead, his eyes scanning our surroundings with the precision of a predator. "Fascinating," he murmured, "a pocket of reality, hidden from the world." I joined him, my heart pounding. "Holmes, what is this place?" "A sanctuary," he replied, his voice low. "Or perhaps a prison. It depends on one's perspective." We moved cautiously down the corridor, the portraits seeming to watch us with lifeless eyes. At the end of the hall, we found a door, its surface etched with the same symbol we had seen in Acton's journal. Holmes pushed it open, revealing a grand library filled with towering bookshelves and a large, circular table at its center. On the table lay a single open book, its pages filled with names, some crossed out, others underlined in red ink. Holmes approached it, his eyes narrowing as he read. "Watson," he said, his voice tense, "these are the names of those the Order has erased. Henry Acton is here, and so are others. Dozens of them." I stepped closer, my unease growing. But why? What could they have done to warrant such a fate? Holmes' expression darkened. They knew too much, and now so do we. Chapter 9. The Watchers. As Holmes continued to examine the book, I became aware of a sound, a faint shuffling, like footsteps on carpet. I turned, my hand instinctively reaching for my revolver, but the room was empty. "Holmes," I whispered, "we're not alone." He nodded, his eyes still fixed on the book. "I know. They've been watching us since we arrived." Before I could respond, the sound grew louder, and the air around us seemed to thicken. Shadows moved at the edges of the room, coalescing into humanoid shapes. They were featureless, their forms shifting and unstable, but their presence was undeniable. Holmes closed the book and turned to face them, his expression calm but resolute. "We mean you no harm," he said, his voice steady. "But we will not be intimidated." The shadows did not respond. Instead, they began to advance, their movements slow and deliberate. I raised my revolver, but Holmes placed a hand on my arm. "Do not fire, Watson. They are not what they seem." As the shadows closed in, the room began to dissolve around us, the walls and floor melting into a swirling void. I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of disorientation, as if the very fabric of reality were unraveling. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. We were back on Caraway Lane, the fog pressing in around us. The house, or whatever it had been, was gone. Holmes looked at me, his expression grim. "They are testing us, Watson, but they have made one mistake." "What's that?" I asked, my voice shaky. "They have shown us their hand, and now we know how to play ours." Chapter 10. The Plan. Back at Baker Street, Holmes wasted no time in formulating our next move. He spread a map of London across the table, his fingers tracing lines and intersections with practiced precision. I watched him, my mind still reeling from the events on Caraway Lane. "Watson," he said, his voice breaking the silence, "we are dealing with an organization that operates beyond the bounds of conventional logic. To confront them directly would be folly. We must outthink them." I nodded, though the idea of outthinking an entity that could manipulate reality itself seemed daunting. "What do you propose, Holmes?" He tapped a finger on the map, indicating a nondescript area near the Thames. "The Order of the Forgotten must have a central hub, a place where they coordinate their activities. If we can locate it, we may be able to disrupt their operations." "But how?" I asked. "We have no leads, no names, no addresses." Holmes smiled faintly. "On the contrary, Watson, we have something far more valuable: their attention. They know we are investigating, and they will be watching us. We must use that to our advantage." He outlined his plan. We would stage a public confrontation, drawing the Order's agents into the open. Holmes would feign a breakthrough in the case, loudly declaring that he had uncovered the truth about Henry Acton and the Order of the Forgotten. Meanwhile, I would observe from the shadows, noting anyone who took an unusual interest in Holmes' announcement. Chapter 11. The Trap. The following evening, Holmes made his move. At a crowded gathering of London's elite, he stood before the assembled guests and declared, "Ladies and gentlemen, I have uncovered a conspiracy that threatens the very fabric of our society. The Order of the Forgotten is real, and I have proof of their existence." The room fell silent, all eyes fixed on Holmes. I stood at the edge of the crowd, my heart pounding as I scanned the faces around me. It didn't take long to spot them. Two men in dark coats, their expressions tense as they exchanged hurried whispers. As Holmes continued his speech, I discreetly followed the men as they slipped out of the room. They moved quickly, their footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. I kept my distance, careful not to alert them to my presence. They led me to a carriage waiting outside, its windows shrouded in black. Before I could get closer, one of the men turned and spotted me. His eyes widened in recognition, and he shouted something to his companion. I froze, unsure of what to do, but before they could act, Holmes appeared behind them, his voice calm but commanding. "Gentlemen, I believe you have something that belongs to me." The men hesitated, then bolted into the carriage, which sped off into the night. Holmes watched them go, a satisfied smile on his lips. "Well, Watson," he said, turning to me, "it seems we have their attention." Chapter 12. The Reveal. The next morning, we received a message from Lestrade. A body had been found in the Thames, a man matching the description of one of the agents we had encountered the previous night. Holmes and I rushed to the scene where Lestrade awaited us. "He had this on him," Lestrade said, handing Holmes a small, leather-bound notebook. Holmes flipped through the pages, his eyes narrowing as he read. "Watson," he said, his voice low, "this is it. The key to unraveling the Order's conspiracy." The notebook contained detailed records of the Order's activities, names, dates, locations. But what caught Holmes' attention was a single entry. "The house on Caraway Lane is the gateway. Those who enter do not return." Holmes closed the notebook, his expression grim. "We must return to Caraway Lane, Watson, but this time we will not be alone." Chapter 13. The Final Confrontation. That evening, Holmes and I, accompanied by Lestrade and a team of constables, returned to Caraway Lane. The fog was thicker than ever, the air heavy with an almost palpable tension. As we approached the gap between numbers 12 and 14, Holmes raised a hand, signaling us to stop. "Do you feel it, Watson?" he whispered. I did. The air seemed to vibrate, as if we were standing on the edge of something vast and unknowable. Suddenly the fog parted, revealing a house that had not been there before. A tall, narrow building with windows that seemed to stare like empty eyes. Holmes stepped forward, his voice steady. "This is it, gentlemen, the gateway to the Order's lair." As we crossed the threshold, I felt a strange sensation, as if the very fabric of reality were shifting around us. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper. Inside, the house was a labyrinth of corridors and rooms, each more disorienting than the last. But Holmes pressed on, his determination unwavering. Finally, we reached a large, circular chamber filled with strange devices and ancient manuscripts. At the center of the room stood a man in a dark coat, his face obscured by shadows. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice echoing in the chamber, "you are too late. The truth you seek is already forgotten." Holmes stepped forward, his eyes blazing. "Not by me." Chapter 14. The Chamber of Shadows. The man in the dark coat stood motionless, his silhouette blending with the shadows that clung to the walls of the circular chamber. The air was thick with the scent of aged parchment and something metallic, like the tang of blood. Holmes stepped forward, his voice cutting through the oppressive silence. "You've gone to great lengths to conceal your work," Holmes said, his tone calm but edged with steel. "But every secret leaves traces, even those you believe erased." The man chuckled, a low, humorless sound that reverberated through the chamber. "You are persistent, Mr. Holmes. But persistence alone cannot unravel what has been unwritten. I glanced around the room, my unease growing. The devices scattered about, strange contraptions of brass and glass, seemed to hum faintly, as if alive. The manuscripts, their pages filled with symbols I did not recognize, lay open as if waiting to be read. But it was the centerpiece of the room that drew my attention. A large, circular table etched with intricate patterns, atop which rested a single, unlit candle. Holmes' eyes flicked to the table, then back to the man. Your order thrives on fear and forgetfulness. But fear is a fragile weapon, and forgetfulness, a temporary state. The man tilted his head, his face still obscured. And yet, here you stand, surrounded by the very truths you cannot comprehend. Tell me, Mr. Holmes, do you truly believe you can stop what you do not understand? Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat and withdrew the leather-bound notebook we had recovered from the Thames. This, he said, holding it aloft, contains more than you realize. Names, dates, locations, fragments of a puzzle you thought destroyed. But fragments, when pieced together, can reveal the whole. The man's posture shifted slightly, a flicker of tension betraying his calm facade. A clever deduction, he admitted. But even if you uncover the truth, who will believe you? Who will remember? Holmes' lips curled into a faint smile. Memory, sir, is a curious thing. It can be suppressed, distorted, even erased, but it can also be reignited. Chapter 15. The Unraveling. The man stepped forward, his movements deliberate, as if testing the space between himself and Holmes. You speak of reigniting memory, Mr. Holmes, but memory is a flame, and flames can be extinguished. Holmes' gaze did not waver, and yet, even the smallest spark can set a forest ablaze. I felt a chill run down my spine as the tension in the room escalated. Lestrade and the constable stood behind us, their hands gripping their truncheons, though they seemed unsure of what to do. The man in the dark coat was an enigma, his presence both commanding and unnerving. Holmes took another step forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Your order has erased countless lives, rewriting history to suit your purposes. But you made one mistake. You underestimated the power of observation. The smallest details, when examined closely, can reveal the grandest truths. The man's hand twitched, as if reaching for something hidden within his coat. And what truth have you uncovered, Mr. Holmes? Holmes' smile widened. That your order is not invincible, that your methods, while effective, are not infallible, and that your greatest weakness is your reliance on secrecy. Before the man could respond, Holmes turned to me. Watson, the candle. I hesitated, unsure of his meaning. Then it struck me. The unlit candle on the table. I stepped forward, struck a match, and lit the wick. The flame flickered to life, casting a warm glow that pushed back the shadows. The man recoiled, his composure faltering for the first time. What are you doing? Holmes' voice was calm but firm. Light, sir, is the enemy of darkness, and truth is the enemy of lies. Chapter 16. The Turning Point. As the candle's flame grew brighter, the chamber seemed to shift around us. The strange devices ceased their humming, and the manuscript symbols began to fade, as if the light were erasing them. The man in the dark coat staggered back, his face finally visible, a gaunt, pale visage marked by deep lines of anger and fear. You cannot do this, he hissed, his voice trembling. You cannot undo what has been done. Holmes stepped closer, his presence unwavering. I already have. The man lunged toward the table, his hand outstretched to extinguish the flame. But Holmes was faster, intercepting him with a swift, precise movement. The two men grappled briefly before Holmes forced him to the ground, pinning him with ease. Lestrade and the constables rushed forward, securing the man with handcuffs. As they dragged him to his feet, he glared at Holmes, his eyes burning with hatred. "You think you've won," he spat. "But the order is vast, its reach limitless. You cannot stop what you do not understand." Holmes straightened his coat, his expression calm. "Perhaps, but I understand enough to know that every secret, no matter how well hidden, can be uncovered. And every truth, no matter how buried, can be brought to light." Chapter 17. The Aftermath. As we left the chamber, the house on Caraway Lane seemed to dissolve behind us, its walls crumbling into the fog as if it had never existed. The constables exchanged uneasy glances, but Holmes appeared unfazed, his focus already shifting to the next step. Back at Baker Street, Holmes poured himself a glass of brandy and sat by the fire, his expression pensive. I joined him, my mind still reeling from the night's events. "Holmes," I said, breaking the silence, "do you believe we've truly stopped them?" He took a sip of his brandy, his gaze fixed on the flames. "For now, Watson. But the Order of the Forgotten is not so easily defeated. They will regroup, adapt, and continue their work. Our victory tonight is but a temporary reprieve." I frowned, the weight of his words settling over me. "Then what can we do?" Holmes turned to me, his eyes gleaming with determination. "We remember, Watson. We remember the names they erased, the truths they buried. And we ensure that others remember as well." He reached into his coat and withdrew the leather-bound notebook, placing it on the table between us. "This is our weapon. Knowledge, once gained, cannot be taken away, not entirely." I nodded, though a sense of unease lingered. "And what of the man we captured? Will he talk?" Holmes' smile was faint but knowing. "He will, eventually. But even if he does not, we have already struck a blow against the Order. And that, Watson, is a start." As I sat there, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The shadows of the Order still loomed, their reach extending beyond what we could see. But for now, we had light. And in that light, though